Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our second episode of How to Get Better at Strategy Card Games. Today's focus is going to be how to gain an advantage on an opponent. So, there are a few different types of advantage that you can gain while playing a card game. There's raw card advantage. This is the most straightforward one, where you can draw more cards using effects that are on your board or in your hand. An example, you can play a card that lets you draw 2 cards. You've just gained raw card advantage. If this were the only card in your hand, you had 1 card in hand, played this, now you have 2. And the concept behind card advantage is that getting more cards raises the chance that you'll be able to do something. Next up is virtual card advantage. This is when you can neutralize multiple of your opponent's cards with one of yours. An example would be using a card that wipes out multiple of your opponent's creatures. That could be an example of virtual card advantage. If you look over here at the pictures, you see Curtain's Call, which is destroy 2 target creatures. And then you have Wrath of God, which can even destroy all creatures. Now, there are 2 of these. Wrath of God is a card that you could use if you're not playing very many creatures, or the creatures you have are not very, they aren't very worthwhile to keep around. Curtain's Call can be more of when you've already developed and you can destroy multiple threats for 1 card. 1 card you've destroyed 2, and you've broken parity with your opponent. You're no longer playing 1 for 1. You are now gaining an advantage, a leg up on your opponent, because you only used 1 card to deal with 2 of theirs. And the last main one here that we're going to talk about is tempo advantage. This is closely related to our last one, but it's more about your actual gameplay and decision making. You're trying to make your opponent struggle to keep up with you. You're trying to answer their threats efficiently, and you can play a cheap card that counters something maybe expensive that they play. That is a difference in tempo. So if you have Ugin the Spirit Dragon up here, in the top right you'll see its cost. It costs 8 mana. The moment Ugin hits the board, he's an immediate threat. But if you just answer it with a counter spell, they spent 8 mana and you spent 2 mana to counter it. That is a 6 mana difference of tempo advantage. If you want a more blatant, more obvious example of this that is outside of a trading card game, but still something that you've probably heard of before, Clash Royale. Clash Royale does it best. Clash Royale, if they play a whole group of characters and they're all rushing your tower, and you just use 1 fireball to take out their whole swarm, you were able to gain a huge tempo advantage, and now you have far more elixir than your opponent to work with. Now, card advantage at its simplest. We're going to go back to card advantage. Traditionally, card advantage refers to the number of cards you have in your hand and the number on the field, as well as to your opponent. Now, we're comparing to your opponent. The more cards you have, the more options and resources you will have to outplay your opponent. So, seeing more cards in the game, even though theoretically in Magic you could draw 10 lands in a row, in One Piece you could just draw all of your non-engine pieces. Any other card game, non-engine pieces, sure, that's possible, but probability, the more cards that you draw, you will start seeing the cards you need. So with that, anything that gives you more playable cards can be considered card advantage, even if it's not directly draw a card. So it doesn't have to be in your hand for it to be playable. Ren's Resolve here says exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards. So not only are you able to draw more cards, you have an extended period of time to play them. And exile is the equivalent in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's banish, and in One Piece or Lorcana it just doesn't exist. But this is something that you can use to access more cards, and if your opponent has cards that can disrupt your gameplay, disrupt your hand, these are actually something that are super reliable. And another card that can affect this, Faithless Looting. It can be in your graveyard. Faithless Looting allows you to draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards. Now, let's assume that you have no cards in your graveyard that can be touched by Faithless Looting, or touched by you once they enter your graveyard. Faithless Looting is still in your graveyard, so if it's your only, if you have this and a couple of other cards in hand, let's say 3 cards, you play this, draw 2, discard 2, you are going to have Faithless Looting still essentially in your hand because it has flashback. It can be used from the graveyard. You got to filter your hand, and if you're able to access cards in your graveyard, anything you discard suddenly becomes card advantage. It's just like back here with Ren's Resolve. Anything that's exiled with Ren's Resolve is card advantage. You are gaining access to those cards to be able to play those cards. And this applies to other games beyond Magic. In One Piece, you have cards like Gecko Moria that can reanimate cards. In Digimon, you have cards that benefit you from having cards in your trash. You can bring cards back from your trash. In Yu-Gi-Oh, Yu-Gi-Oh uses the graveyard so often that it's just an extension of your hand. In most card games, the graveyard can be considered the hand part 2. You just need to build around that. Now, if you can draw extra cards or make your opponent lose cards, you're gaining card advantage. So not just drawing cards, but making them lose cards. This gives you more tools to work with while also limiting your opponent's options. So if you play things like Thoughtseize, where you get to pick something that they take out, Negative Hollow takes something at random, or Drop Off is repetitively a repeating effect. No, it's not a repeating effect, my apologies. But Drop Off is a card that makes them discard the card they just drew. These cards are ways to limit the number of cards in your opponent's hand. These do technically set you to card neutral, because you're losing a card and they're losing a card, but you have the ability to choose with things like Thoughtseize. Drop Off, maybe they're just trying to get top deck, and that's the game you're playing. You bring the game to a top deck. And Negative Hollow, in One Piece, very often you can attack in, and they can discard cards to protect themselves. And once they've discarded all their cards, they have maybe 2 or 3 cards they really want to hold on to, and you play Negative Hollow, now one of their key cards is gone. Now, there are also effects that can filter cards. Just like Faithless Looting on the slide before and still on this slide, this can be considered card neutral. If you have nothing that affects cards in your graveyard, then the cards like Preordain, where you scry 2, just the process of scrying, you can look at it, you can filter, so card filtering is there, but then you're trading 1 Preordain for 1 card that's in your deck. You just have the ability to filter. With Consider, you're looking at the top card of your deck, and you can put it in your graveyard to keep it on top, and then replace Consider with 1 card. Consider is played in Consider and Faithless Looting are played in decks that use their graveyard because it's card advantage. If you played this in pretty much any other deck, it could be considered card neutral. You must go up in hand size or hand size equivalent for it to be considered card advantage. Otherwise, it's card negative or card neutral. If you are a graveyard deck and you are building up your graveyard, but you're not necessarily going up in hand size, you are still gaining card advantage. Now, with everyone trying to gain card advantage, you need to find a way to slow down your opponent other than just discarding. So, one tactic you can use is starving. Starving is something that became very popular in the One Piece card game as a strategy, but primarily in games with life card systems, where whether or not you win the game is based on a stack of cards. Every time you take damage, draw a card from it. That is going to be a way where you might want to take life early to draw more cards, to gain access to more cards, to get that advantage on your opponent. So the idea of starving is that you don't feed into your opponent's plan. You watch how they're playing, you know what decks they're playing, and you're able to limit how much you're feeding into their game plan. In games like Magic, in multiplayer, as opposed to French formats like Commander, players will even politic their way or try to politic their way into card advantage. Like Stitcher Supplier, a 1/1 that when it enters or dies, you mill 3. You take the top 3 cards of your deck and put it in your graveyard. They'll probably say, hey, player 3, if I attack you, Stitcher Supplier, can you kill it? You have a 3/3 on board and it's just a 1/1. Your creature will live. And quite often, someone at the table is going to be willing to take that offer to gain that person as a potential friend or a potential alliance. And you can, but when you're playing at a more competitive level, you need to pay attention to what your opponents are doing, because the moment you block Stitcher Supplier and kill it, then you are giving your opponent 3 more cards. No one plays Stitcher Supplier saying, I'm going to win this game by attacking with Stitcher Supplier. They play it thinking, I'm going to draw 6 cards for 1 card. Don't let them. Now, card neutral can be a trap in other card games than Magic, like One Piece. Now, One Piece is a game that is so reliant on card advantage, which is why I am mentioning it so often, even though this is a Magic channel. This card on board is a leader. It allows you to have a life card system that when you draw your last card, you replace it with a card from the top of your deck. In return, you have to discard a card from your own hand. And so a lot of players will actually think that when I attack my opponent, they have to discard a card, right? So it's actually, they're setting them negative. But in reality, you're not. So if you look at this, I'm going to use my cursor here. If you look at this first image, there's 1 life card left. They have 3 cards in hand, and they have their leader. If you attack them, they pick up that last card, and they have 0 life cards, but they have 4 cards in hand. You just had them draw a card. And then once the ability happens, they trash a card and put 1 card from the top of their deck down, face down. All you did here was draw them a card and let them decide out of those 4 cards which one they're picking. You actually give your opponent card filtering, set them card neutral, and maybe even have opened up an opportunity for your opponent to counterattack. Now, keeping this in mind, how do you actually win with card advantage? Sure, you could draw a bunch of cards, but if you never actually if you don't take actions, or if you don't play around it, you're not going, you can fumble and you can lose games by not closing in the game. So here's what you can do. You can maximize your card draw. First off, any card draw effects. Always look for opportunities to draw more cards. You could do it during the game with specific card abilities, or during your deck building, strategic deck building, of making sure that you have some searchers, some tutors, some card draw spells. Then you can force discards. You can disrupt your opponent's plans by making them discard key cards. And finally, you can have efficient trades. This is where you're going to gain the real visible advantage Aim to trade your cards in a way that leaves you with more resources. If you can trade one card to eliminate 2 of your opponents, you're gaining card advantage. If you can manage to play effects that just blow card advantage out of the water when you are in a neutral position in the game, that means you're not winning, that means you're not losing. Everyone is kind of just in a neutral position. If there is one person winning, everyone else is in a losing position. So every player has to be in a neutral position for anyone to be in a neutral position in the game. That's not neutral, that's not card neutral, that's neutral position, saying what's your ability to win the game right now. And if you are all in card neutral, not card neutral, if you're all in neutral position in the game, you will almost always go into a winning position in the game if you are able to play something that sets them card, just sets everyone else card negative and sets you card positive, card advantage. So you have Siphon Mind here on the left that says each other player discards a card. And then you draw a card for each card discarded this way. Unlike the cards earlier, like Thoughtseize, that just said, okay, I'm using a card to get rid of one of your cards. Siphon Mind says, I'm using a card, get rid of one of your cards, and I'll draw a card off of it. If you have a multiplayer format like Commander with a full pot of 4 players, Siphon Mind is use 1 card, get rid of 3 cards, and draw 3 cards. Now that is incredible. That is something that blows the game out of the water. Charlotte Pudding. In a game like One Piece, you don't have a max hand size. You will very often see hands that approach 10 cards, 15 cards. I've even had a hand above 15 cards in certain decks. If someone plays a Charlotte Pudding and has your opponent return all cards from the hand into their deck, shuffle up, and draw 5, let's say you had a hand of 15 cards, you just essentially made your opponent discard 10 cards. But if they're playing a graveyard deck, they don't even have access to those cards because it's at the bottom of their deck. Well, it's shuffled into their deck. And there's a chance that you get them into completely, like, just horrible 5 cards, and maybe they could have discarded 10 cards and still been okay, but they don't even necessarily get to keep those the 5 that were okay. They get their hand destroyed, dismantled. They don't get to access it in their graveyard. They don't get to access it in their exile. They don't get to access it. It's in their deck. They have to draw more cards to do anything. Now, back to Magic, with Narset Part of Veils, each opponent can't draw more than 1 card a turn. Well, you're already ahead against any deck trying to draw cards, because they're not going to be able to outpace you, and Narset herself adds card advantage. So if your opponent is prevented from drawing additional cards at least once, and you use Narset's ability at least once, it's the same thing as Siphon Mind in a 1v1 game. Now let's say you play Windfall with Narset on board. Windfall will have everyone discard their hand, and then each of your opponents will only draw 1 card, and then you will draw cards equal to the greatest number that a player discarded. So let's say that number was 7. You'll draw 7, and then your opponent will draw 1 card, because they can't draw more than 1 card that turn. That is the kind of thing that if you are in a neutral position in a card game, Windfall Narset Part of Veils is going to be what can win you the game on the spot. Now, thank you for watching. You can check out my other channel for One Piece content. You can support me on Patreon. I currently have no cardboard enthusiasts, but for $5, your name could appear at the end of my video. If you have thoughts on card advantage, card neutral, card negative, or any tempo swings, let me know down below, and I will see you next time, everyone.